What's going on, guys? This is Jake at That Fit Friend. I'm joined here with my friend Alec Blenis. I'm in Minneapolis, Minnesota right now, visiting Alec. He's helping me with some content and some exercises, more specifically single leg exercises, which you've kind of like built this like really strong branding for yourself with. But Alec, thanks for coming on the channel. Essentially in this video, I want to pick your brain on single leg training. I know a lot of subscribers here do a lot of single leg work, and I want to learn how to do it better and learn some of the things that you've learned along the way, because your single leg strength is sick. So thanks for coming on the channel. To kind of give you a cueing here, like why do you love single leg work so much, and why has that become such a big staple in your brand and your training?
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks for having me, Jake. Big fan of single leg work. Love incorporating my training and my client programming. I find that, when it comes to your big bilateral lifts, like your squats, your deadlifts, etc., a lot of coaches are really well versed and proficient at coaching and cueing those exercises, getting people to do them really well and get a lot out of them. But when it comes to some of your single leg stuff, like your split squats, your single leg deadlifts, they're almost an afterthought. They tend to not be programmed as well, cued as well, and athletes often just don't see the value, so they don't put as much effort into them either. But I think if you kind of elevate them in your program, give them a little bit more importance, learn to coach and cue them a little bit better, there's a ton of value there. When it comes to single leg work, I don't think that it's important just because it's on one leg. That doesn't make the exercise special, but it does allow us to kind of get into some unique positions, train certain tissues that we usually can't encounter on two legs. So I'd love to talk to you guys more today about how to get as much out of it as you can.
Yeah, so I guess where my mind goes is I want to be more proficient with single leg work for the tissue capabilities and just the general strength. Like, where do you even start? Like, are there exercises that you would say like are nice go-tos for somebody who might be more beginner, intermediate, that they maybe do split squats now or lunges, but like, what are some good exercises to begin with regarding building your single leg capabilities?
For sure. So when most people think of single leg work, they probably think of, like single leg deadlifts with a kettlebell, Bulgarian split squats, that kind of thing. And those are great exercises. But what I find is that single leg work really shines when you allow those exercises and utilize those exercises to get you into positions that you don't otherwise see and kind of branch out of your normal movement patterns. When you do an exercise that is totally free of constraints, tons of degrees of freedom, it's really easy to just default into your natural way of moving and not get some of the unique benefits that single leg exercises have. So I tend to start people off with more constrained, supported single leg exercises. And by that, I mean, instead of doing a freestanding single leg deadlift, try a single leg deadlift, with your foot posted against the wall. Try a Smith machine, try a landmine attachment, something that gives you a little bit of feedback. Then you'll be able to really work into some of those more challenging positions that don't come as naturally to you.
Got it. So essentially, like if I were to start, let's say with a single leg deadlift floating, and I was opening my hip or I couldn't get balanced, scaling it back, and not in the sense of like going more beginner and regressing, but scaling it back based on my feedback by using a wall, maybe a dowel, maybe even holding on to something if I'm doing like some form of lower body like leg exercise there without a deadlift, obviously, where I'm holding onto a barbell. Yeah. That would be a really good move to explore.
Absolutely.
Now, question for you then. We talked a little bit about progressions and like lengths of time using single leg work yesterday at dinner. And I found it really interesting about how you mentioned like folks don't give it enough time. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, where it's like, yeah, doing like 4 weeks of single leg work in a block with one exercise and then switching exercise probably isn't the most productive. Can you elaborate a little bit on that regarding timelines?
Yeah, for sure. So in terms of, periodization, for example, I generally find that it's best not to totally ignore or neglect any athletic quality at any given time. So if you're an athlete that cares about maximal strength, you should probably keep some heavy work in your program at all times rather than just ignoring it completely. And stability is no different. So if you ignore, the single leg work or stabilization work, so to speak, at any time in your program, you're gonna lose that skill. You're always gonna be kind of starting back at square one every time you throw those split squats or single leg deadlifts back in your program. But if you keep something like that in your program at all times, you'll be able to get enough exposure to those exercises that you actually get good at them. And single leg work, especially freestanding single leg work, does have a skill and coordination component to it. So if you're not giving it the time it deserves to really master that skill, you're gonna have a hard time getting a lot of value from that exercise. So I always tell people, especially if you want to utilize some more of those freestanding variations, keep at them for a long time and really try to get good at them skill-wise. if you're going to rotate your exercise selection a little bit more often, or if you're newer to these types of exercises and you're not quite as proficient at them yet, I highly encourage using some external support. There's no shame in holding on to something for some balance, using a split stance instead of totally single leg. You're only going to benefit yourself and help yourself there and allow yourself to lift some more weight and get more out of it right away.
Now, question for you, because I know a lot of folks who subscribe to the channel program for themselves. So let's say we give it 16 weeks to get really good at single leg deadlifts, freestanding. We're feeling proficient, we're getting a little heavier. If we transition to a different goal and we don't necessarily have that as a staple in our program, would you recommend using it maybe as an auxiliary or an accessory at a lighter weight just to kind of keep fine tuning that movement pattern? Or like, is there a duration of time where you think people would be safe maybe not performing that, but still having that skill? And then if they get back into it, maybe like use a constraint for the first week, second week. Like, I'm just curious about the logistics of your madness and programming mind when it comes to that style of implementing an exercise for duration, taking it out, bringing it back in, etc.
For sure. So one of the things that makes like a single leg deadlift, for example, challenging is you have to be able to get good hip internal rotation in the bottom position. You have to be able to externally rotate to come back up. You basically just need strength in that kind of frontal plane and transverse plane in your hip, as opposed to more just sagittal plane, as in like a bilateral squat and deadlift. So I encourage people, even if you're not always doing single leg deadlifts, for example, have something in your program that kind of challenges the hip itself in some more of those extreme positions that you might not see with your bilateral exercises. That doesn't mean, again, that you have to do a heavy single leg deadlift. It might mean that you incorporate something like a hip airplane in your warm up, some Copenhagen planks or single leg side plank dips, some exercises like that to keep working the hip in that range of motion and in those positions will allow you to return to some of that single leg work and still have strength in the muscles and range of motions that you need.
Got it. Okay, so you don't necessarily need to perform that exercise every single week, but being proficient in like the main core staples of that movement pattern can have a lot of positive carryover.
Exactly.
Got it. So let's say I am starting out with a split squat and I want to get really good at building that. Can you just give us like maybe like a very basic framework? And obviously there's a lot of nuance here and you don't have to like have anything definitive, but like where would you start a beginner in the gym who's like getting into split squats and wants to build their legs? Start with just the traditional split squat? Would you start with the constraint? And then how would you progress that from there?
For sure. So I like to start with constraints because I find it is a lot easier to learn the exercise. From there, I don't think that constraints or lack thereof is better or worse than the other. I kind of like to rotate cyclically between more constrained and less constrained variations. So I would usually teach someone a split squat, whether it's on a Smith machine or with the PVC pipe in their hand for a little balance. That makes it a lot easier to learn the movement pattern. But like for me in my personal programming, big fan of single leg deadlifts. I tend to rotate every 6 to 8 weeks between a freestanding single leg deadlift, a landmine, a split stance, a wall supported, and I just kind of keep that cycle going indefinitely. So every time I rotate back to that prior variation, I tend to be a little bit stronger than the last time it was in my program, but I always have something in that general category.
Got it. And before we take this video out, do you have any other lessons that you want to talk about with single leg work that you've learned? Because I think in the context of moving the most weight pound for pound single leg, I would put you up there in the upper echelon. So do you have any lessons that you've learned along the way over your last few years of implementing some heavier single leg deadlifts, etc., into your workout programs?
Yeah, definitely. When we think of the squat and the deadlift and some of those big compound staples, people have so many different variations for it. They take them very seriously. They get their wrist wraps out, they put their belts on, their knee sleeves, all that kind of stuff to lift a lot of weight and just have more options to have some fun with the exercise. Pauses, tempo, whatever. But then when it comes to single leg work, it's like 3 sets of 10 for everything. So I think applying some of the things that you already know how to do with your heavier exercises, take your single leg exercises more seriously and apply some of those strategies too. You can throw in some pauses, you can add some more support and constraints and go heavy for like a set of 5. Like you can do all sorts of these things on one leg too. I think if you just go, fairly light to moderate weight for 3 sets of 10 forever, you're really holding yourself back in terms of what these exercises can do for you.
I love that, and I think that's a great lesson and takeaway there. And final thing to kind of add that, and you just kind of like spark this in my brain, is when you're doing more single leg work over bilateral, do you personally, and this is a very individual thing, tend to feel less beat up? Because I have my bias and like opinion here, but do you typically feel maybe just like a little bit better regarding your movement, your joints and everything else when you're doing more single leg versus bilateral, or have you experienced that?
Yeah, you know, this is a really interesting topic to me because I think part of the reason that people get so beat up with some of their bilateral lifts is because they've been doing them a long time, they're pretty good at them, and they start really pushing, you know, maybe overreaching a little bit, doing everything they can to squeak out a little bit more volume or a little bit more intensity, and that has a way of beating you up, where when you go to more of a single leg program or incorporate more of those exercises, one, you're getting a little bit more variety, so you're not just hammering the same tissue over and over again, but they're also kind of a novel stimulus where you don't have to go 10 out of 10 effort to get some gains out of it. So I think it can be a little bit more gentle as well. But if you were to, for example, go, you know, full bore into just a, you know, training for a 1 rep max lunge competition and you got really, really good at it, I've personally found like trying to chase the like 2.5 time body weight lunge, I can get a little beat up from that too, just as a function of being very proficient and putting in a ton of intensity and volume.
Gotcha.
So kind of the same laws apply, but I think having some more movement options to kind of distribute that stress across throughout your week is only gonna make you feel better.
Gotcha, and I guess where my mind went is like when I'm bilateral squatting and deadlifting a lot in a program, I think at times I can neglect putting myself into ranges of motion that I probably need to work on because I can compensate a little bit more when I'm on 2 feet.
Yeah.
So I'm always curious because like I have a timeline in which I'll feel really good with bilateral work before I start to get beat up. And then when I implement more single leg and more unilateral stuff, I typically kind of like auto correct a lot of that going on. So I was curious if you kind of had a similar mindset or experience there. And like that's obviously very individual, and we're not saying, oh, single leg work is healthy. Like that's not at all what this is, but I'm just always curious to pick other athletes' brains there. But before we wrap this video up, man, do we have any other topics that you want to hit on with single leg work?
Rest between sides in your single leg work. Give yourself the rest that you need to. Like, you know, people do their set of 5 squats and they'll take a couple minutes. Your single leg work should feel very similar. You know, if you're ripping 10, 12 reps right into 10 to 12 more on the other side, back and forth real quick, chances are you're not putting the kind of effort into that exercise that you really need to see the progress that you want. So remember, single leg work is not that unique compared to the other things that you know how to do really well. Just give it the time and energy it deserves.
If there's one thing you're taking away from this video, I think that is the biggest lesson that lifters overlook. Rest between your legs. I always laugh like when I'm programming for clients and they're like, whoa, that's a game changer, resting between my left and right. I'm like, yeah, dude, we're pushing high intensities on Bulgarians. Like, of course, like we want to rest. He's like, I've never done that. And it's like, your second leg then is always like a little bit haphazard and worse, so to speak, than your first, and it's because you're rushing. But dude, I think that's a major key and a major takeaway. But Alec, thank you so much for coming on the channel. We've also filmed some single leg deadlift videos. Definitely check those out. Those are gonna be obviously linked throughout this video, as you've probably seen in the cards up there. But Alec, thanks for coming on, man. I sincerely appreciate it. All of his information is gonna be linked down below. Definitely check out Alec. Sick athlete, sick coach. Inquire about coaching. He is an awesome dude to learn from. But as always, y'all, if you have any questions, drop a comment down below or reach out to one of us personally. Drop a like on the video, drop subscribe to the channel. We'll see you in the next one.